I call the Honourable Shane Mallard.
Deputy President, thank you. Get the notes right. So many versions of the speech. It's the right one. Madam Deputy President, I move the motion 582, is that right, standing in my name, regarding fighting for our lives.
Sorry, Mr Mallard, you need to move the short form format.
No, it's...
my apologies.
By not moving anything, it stays long form. We're going
I do apologise, that's my mistake.
That's okay. I've got an hour and a half speech. Look, today, and don't take away from the activity today. It's been very serious matters on the table today. But this is a serious matter as well because this book, and I'll get more formal in a minute. This book commemorates the 35th anniversary of the AIDS Council of New South Wales, and this is at a time, the AIDS crisis, the AIDS pandemic that killed millions around the world, thousands in New South Wales, and this is at a time when we're confronting another pandemic of a disease within our community, and it's sort of apt to look at the history of what's happened in our state. I rise to speak on my motion, Fighting for Our Lives, by author and journalist Nick Cook, and I acknowledge that he was here earlier today. I did suggest that the timing of when we would do this debate would be difficult to know. It might be best just to get the video. He might be watching online. This motion derives from my attendance at the launch of Nick's book, which was commissioned by ACON, formerly known as the AIDS Council of New South Wales, to commemorate the organisation's 35th anniversary, and it's in the motion when that was in February, before the pandemic started, just before. It was nearly 40 years ago, in November 1982, that the first case of HIV/AIDS was diagnosed in Sydney, 40 years ago, signalling the beginning of an epidemic that frightened and shocked the country. It's quite a pertinent time, as I said, for Nick Cook's book, Fighting for Our Lives, the history of the community response to AIDS, to be published this year when the world is currently dealing with a new pandemic, COVID-19. Respected gay historian Gary Wotherspoon states in his review of the book for the Australian Book Review online that, and I quote, "Part of the reason for the fear and paranoia it engendered, that is the emergence of AIDS, was that it was utterly unexpected. Even though Sydneysiders had survived many epidemics in the past, from smallpox in 1789 to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918-1920, all of which affected thousands of people, some with immense death rates, a range of medical developments over the 20th century, such as inoculations and vaccinations, on top of existing strict quarantine regulations, had led us to believe that medical science had finally got disease under control. It's exactly what I think we thought before this pandemic hit. And since World War II, new generations of Australians had grown up secure in the belief that science had ended epidemics and they were a thing of the past, although they were common for our grandparents. Madam Deputy President, that analysis in that commencement of that book review by Gary Wotherspoon rings truer today than it did even then when he wrote it, as we fight the global pandemic, taking thousands and thousands of lives. Now, Madam President, Deputy President, why is this motion important? This motion is important. It's more than acknowledging an excellent social and community history book, which I have here with me. Members can get it from the Parliamentary Library. But it's also about the work of ACON in saving countless lives through their public health advocacy in relation to HIV/AIDS epidemic. It's about an organisation that was born of community. Fighting for Our Lives is the history of the AIDS Council of New South Wales, a community organisation that emerged in Sydney in 1985. And as you heard me say, the disease emerged in Sydney in 1982. So 3 years into the pandemic, ACON was created. That's historical that happened. I served, Madam Deputy President, I served a few years on the board of ACON in the late 1990s to the year 2000. I was a board member. And of interest to members of this place would be the fact that I filled a vacancy on the board, previously filled by Marise Payne, who is, of course, our current Foreign Minister. and Maurice was on the board of ACON for a couple of years, and I replaced her. In those days, the leadership of ACON, and this is a theme in the book, which only goes to 2000, the book, in terms of covering the period of ACON. In those days, the leadership of ACON, people like the late and lovely Chris Gratian, or Peter Grogan, and the CEO of that time, Stevie Clayton, worked hard to maintain a non-partisan, a bipartisan balance of political views on the board. I was the token Liberal at the time, not surely, and that non-partisanship was crucial in the organisation's credibility in dealing with governments and oppositions of the day, because, as you'll see in the book, and I'll touch on, the bipartisanship at state and federal level was one of the most critical elements of our community success and our health success in managing the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Australia. It's important to note, it's an important point, a vital point actually, that state and federal bipartisanship is credited as one of the key factors in the success of ACON and the unique community and government partnership to fight the AIDS crisis. I'll note, as an aside, in a practical way, the bipartisanship built strong alliances to the point where, it's the second time today I've mentioned John Fahey, and I certainly spoke about him yesterday, to the point where when John Fahey was Premier, and in fact Maurice Payne, no longer on the board of the AIDS Council, was an advisor, and she gave a great eulogy at the funeral for him. As Premier, John Fahey, the former TAB headquarters, dreadful building on Commonwealth Street, just in sort of East Sydney, Darlinghurst there, was allocated, provided as a home for the AIDS Council at Peppercorn Rent for quite a few years, and we ran many programs and events there for a whole range of education awareness programs and treatment programs out of that building. And that was at Peppercorn Rent, and the Liberal government provided that, but it was bipartisan. Through the efforts and advocacy and bravery of several gay men in Sydney, starting in 1983, and the book goes through in detail their early meetings and does a character sketch of these individuals and how what they were trying to achieve. Organised support for community organisation that would help represent the needs and perspectives of people most affected by HIV/AIDS, and through government support for their efforts. ACON was established to help HIV/AIDS sufferers and provide HIV prevention education and specialised peer education, counselling for the community and more widely. And in the book, and it's a history account written by a journalist and author, focuses in on some individuals of the time, and the author freely admits there are other interpretations. And of course, I have actually got a history degree, and I really respect that this book's been written from primary sources, from the copious minutes of all of the AIDS Council's meetings, and some of them are hilarious, and obviously tragic and serious, and many of the authors of the minutes are reported as having died of AIDS. The gay press, the obituary advertisements, are all trawled through to provide the primary resource for this book. Cook's book is a comprehensive history of how this organisation was founded, the key movers and shakers involved, and how it helped shape the community response to HIV/AIDS in New South Wales specifically, but also more widely in Australia. And it has to be noted that the people interviewed for the book are, of course, the survivors of HIV/AIDS, and those who died only recorded in the sense of the documentation of what they had done during that period. So it's also a survivor's story. It's a history of the many groups and people who contributed immensely to mobilising support for people living with AIDS, HIV/AIDS, and education, counselling and treatment for affected communities. Too many, as I say, too many of these people perished in the AIDS pandemic in Australia. The Australian response to HIV/AIDS is internationally regarded as one of the most progressive in the world, and effective, and early collaboration between government and affected communities was a key part of this response. This effective collaboration was facilitated by activists being confronted by illness and death daily amongst their community, and they quickly mobilised to demand, and because government was a bit slow off the mark on this, to demand a compassionate and pragmatic response from state and federal government, as well as the governments that acted quickly to ensure the needs of the affected communities were met. Fighting for Our Lives captures the events of this historic period. It captures the accounts of the people, it captures the fights, captures the divisions within the community. That's not a surprise. anyone who, any community organisations have divisions, and of course they were quite radical. And the book talks about the really hardline radical gay community members in is it called ACT UP? Yeah, ACT UP, who were taking it very seriously with quite aggressive protests and threats to get the funding for research and some of the drugs. This book account is timely and tells a huge part of the HIV/AIDS story that has often been overlooked. I don't think there's been a lot of this story told. In fact, I don't think there's enough of it been told. That the affected communities of Australia played the leading role in battling this virus. A community response led the fight on this virus. And in the end, it was a tripartite response: community, research and government. So doctors, medical and government that worked on this uniquely in the world. Nick Cook comments, and I'll quote Nick, the author, "The level of cooperation between affected communities, medical authorities and the political establishment was extraordinary, making the Australian response one of the best and would be the best in the world." According to Cook, it is difficult today to fully comprehend the bravery of those advocates who took a stand for their communities. In the 1980s, Australia, gay men, sex workers and people who inject drugs were highly stigmatised. Some are still stigmatised today. They did not trust authorities for very good reasons, and they often received little sympathy from society, and certainly not from the media. They had to take the struggle into their own hands. In the process, they created an entirely new model which survives today of public health. Members will note that the motion includes Section G, an acknowledgement, a comprehensive motion, an acknowledgement of the Social Issues Committee inquiry into gay and transgender hate crimes between 1970 and 2010, which was reported to this House, and of course we're undertaking a second inquiry as we speak, and members of the inquiry are here, some of them are here now. Now, this acknowledgement in the motion was inserted at the recommendation of ACON, whom I carefully consulted when I drafted this motion. And I would say I was taken aback, and I'm heartened that acknowledgement of our work from our committee work from the Peak Community Organisation, from that Peak Community Organisation, and again underscores the good work our committee processes in our House can do in addressing issues impacting upon communities, whether that's historic or current. And indeed, as recorded in the report of the Social Issues Committee, violence perpetrated on gays and transgender, violence and of course murders over this time, the HIV/AIDS pandemic peak time, was sometimes directly, and there's evidence of that, and often indirectly motivated by AIDS-based phobia. Mr. President, Madam Deputy President, I openly identified as a gay man in the mid-1990s. It's relatively later in life compared to the young gay men today who seem to discover it while they're still at high school or uni. I arrived on the scene, as they said in those days, at the very tail end of the death wave from the AIDS pandemic, the tail end of it. I arrived in a community that was deeply in shock, fearful, very fearful, and mourning lost friends and lovers. Some of the people I worked with at ACON had until recently at that time attended one or more AIDS funerals a week. And I recall Clover Moore, who I have great respect for in regards to this period as a local state member, telling us that she attended 2 or 3 AIDS-related funerals a week during the peak of the pandemic. There was the impact, the fatigue, the exhaustion, the emotional draining of that period was so much that many people had stopped attending funerals and had stopped attending community events and were starting to withdraw from the battle against HIV/AIDS. It seemed that it was winning. I recall one board meeting where Chris Gratian, who was the chairman, or president I think it was called then, kicked off a discussion like a workshop with us about using the term the AIDS crisis, which is what we were using all the time, which ACON had used since its inception. Chris said, how on earth can we be in a crisis for, at that point, 15 years? That's bloody exhausting, he said. And indeed, he was right. The community, and I've got a note here about the candlelight vigils, started to have less and less people attending them, even though they had many thousands at the peak. But in the end, people were just so exhausted and fatigued that not lots were attending. The community was exhausted, but I will say that new fresh players stepped up to the plate to take on the responsibilities. Lesbian women like Stevie Clayton took up leadership roles at ACON to continue the community fight against HIV/AIDS. Fortuitously, around this time, medical advances started to deliver hope for people living with HIV/AIDS, with combined therapy treatments turning a near certain death sentence into a manageable chronic disease. And today, it's just amazing. Today, of course, we have a HIV blocker. It's not a vaccine, but you could sort of call it a vaccine equivalent, called PrEP. And that has changed the lives of gay men, and it will drive down the infection rate dramatically, save lives. People in the younger generation, younger than me, simply have no concept of what really occurred over those pre-year 2000 years. The people who lived through those times, particularly those in the front line of the battle, deserve our acknowledgement, admiration and gratitude. One of the guests at the book launch was Don Baxter, who served in ACON's first governing committee before being elected as its president in 1987. That, I just might note, is the year of the dreaded Grim Reaper TV commercials, to give a perspective of what was happening in the broader society. He later took on the role of chief executive from 1990 to 1996, the worst years of the epidemic. It was during Baxter's time at ACON that life-saving HIV treatment finally became a reality. His insights are among the many that are featured in Fighting for Our Lives. Don says that, and I quote, "Those early years were an uncertain, harrowing time for our communities. When ACON was formed, it was during a period of hysteria, fear, grief, sadness and trauma. Many people, mostly healthy young men, were getting sick and dying. But we rallied together, and in time we were able to deliver vital HIV prevention, treatment, support and care programs and services which helped save countless lives. By telling this story, we hope to ensure younger generations, this is the story in the book, younger generations within our communities, people in mainstream society, as well as future policymakers, are aware of the dramatic struggle, the life and death struggle that took place here in New South Wales throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Fighting for Our Lives is essentially an organisational history pieced together from ACON's rich archive, which I referred to before, the queer community press from the period of interviews with surviving AIDS figures. But the ACON case study also tells a greater account about a country's innovations in modern public health, which was essentially a three-way collaboration, as I said, between AIDS-affected communities, the medical establishment and the state and policymakers. It should be celebrated and acknowledged that Australia is one of the few countries in the world, I think it's an important thing that we should acknowledge, that evaded a HIV/AIDS epidemic among intravenous drug users. USA had a serious epidemic through its drug users. We prevented that through the syringe exchange program, or provision services, as it was later changed to. And again, a difficult bipartisan policy taken in the state by both sides of politics. Australia has not registered a single confirmed case of HIV transmission from a female sex worker, compared to almost every other country in the world. And Cook argues in the book that these are some of our greatest public health achievements. Media scaremongering and the attitude of political reactionaries are recurring themes in this history. Some figures in this place are in the book. Australia's official response may have been admirable. However, the media still revelled in portraying gay men as serious threats to society and a danger to public health. While children and straight people with HIV/AIDS became objects of sadness and sorrow, rightly so, gay men, sex workers and drug users were shamed and humiliated. One of the most harrowing aspects of researching this history, the author says, has been seeing pages after pages of young men's faces in the Star Observer death notices. This is another of the book's themes, death notifications, matter-of-factly recorded, indicating both the scale and the timeline of these deaths. So you'll be reading about someone in this book who's been a key player in the creation of ACON, and just all of a sudden it'll just be written in a sentence or say, so-and-so died on this date. Again and again you see that in the book. The book is punctuated with these single lines that notes that someone has died. They are shocks at first as you read it, but you become numb after reading a few, and I think that's an insight to what the community went through. The book does focus on the work of a few individuals who played key roles in ACON and associated groups, but it does so in a way that does justice to the broader community effort, in my view. The reporting of the coronavirus presently echoes of panic and disruptive role the media is playing during the worst years of the AIDS crisis. We should remember the lessons we learned in this history. Fighting for Our Lives is a perfectly timed reminder of the potential in this country to rise above a climate of hysteria, reactionary public policy to support humane, evidence-based, and it's important to say that evidence-based public health initiatives backed by medical and scientific experts and delivered by and for the communities directly affected. I congratulate Nick Cook on his important social history. I warmly congratulate ACON on its 35th anniversary. I acknowledge all the community members all those who served on ACON boards over the many years, of course they're volunteers. I acknowledge all the community members involved, including those who are not really well recorded in official records and should be, the Aboriginal communities, the people from overseas, gay men and others from overseas, the Asian communities who were very stigmatised in that period, transgender who were certainly hidden in the shadows and emerging these days, thank goodness, and of course the incredible work of the lesbian community, among others, in the fight against HIV/AIDS. They're not prominent in history records, but they're all part of that journey. I acknowledge all the staff, to name it, ACON and other organisations, including St Vincent's Hospital and New South Wales Health. I acknowledge the policy and political leaders then and now, and most importantly, I acknowledge all those who tragically lost their lives in the AIDS pandemic. Madam Deputy President, excellent timing. I commend the motion to the House.